I'm making a list, checking it twice. Ban Ki-moon is coming to town.
10 years ago, when a former South Korean diplomat took the helm at the United Nations, he was determined to be a unifying figure. Ban Ki-moon was arriving at a time when the UN was divided over the US war in Iraq.
Wants to work with the United Nations.
For some, his demure style of leadership seemed to be aimed at steering clear of controversy. But in such a prominent role, silence can be deafening. He congratulated Iran's then-president Mahmoud Ahmadinejad for his victory in 2009, but faced criticism for not addressing allegations of electoral fraud and post-election violence. His top priority from the start was global warming.
I'm convinced that climate change and what we do about it will define us.
And one of his crowning achievements is the new accord forged in Paris to limit global carbon emissions and slow the pace of climate change. Ban inherited growing criticism of the world body itself, namely that it's feckless and cowardly. A view reinforced by allegations that UN watchdog programs had failed to root out corruption and expose sexual misconduct among UN peacekeepers, along with criticism of the UN's role in Haiti's cholera epidemic. Ban leaves behind a barrage of crises for his successor, a list including the specter of genocide in South Sudan, advances in North Korea's nuclear arms program, and unprecedented numbers of refugees on the move, as well as the war in Syria.
We have collectively failed the people of Syria.
The organization is the cornerstone of multilateralism, but the challenges are now surpassing our ability to respond. The UN must be ready to change.
After 10 years as the UN's High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres is seen as having the right experience for the UN's top job. And there's hope the former Portuguese Prime Minister can bring a creative approach to diplomacy, something critics say his predecessor lacked. Guterres has promised to focus more on people and less on bureaucracy. But the tasks before him and the UN are a tall order, including calls for reform amid accusations non-European nations aren't properly represented. Guterres' term may not only shape how some of the most intractable conflicts play out,
I, Antonio Guterres,
but also whether the UN as a global system of governance can resurrect its sense of purpose in the face of those who say its relevance is fading. Randolph Noble, The Newsmakers.
Well, I'm joined now by Dr. Alexandra Novoselov. She's a scholar at the Center on International Cooperation at New York University, and her research focuses on the United Nations. Thanks so much for joining us. 10 years on, what sort of grading would you give Ban Ki-moon in his report card?
It's a mixed record, to say the least. So, I don't know, very mixed record, especially in peace and security.
He considers his work in combating climate change as his proudest. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think he did a lot on climate change, which was, needed for our planet, and he brought consensus on that, but he left a bit aside the peace and security agenda.
Mm-hmm. Looking at some of the issues over the past 10 years, you have those, I guess, what can be termed mistakes, whereas individuals were culpable, but the system didn't really set out to commit these grave errors, whether it was cholera in Haiti, which the UN was responsible for, or the sexual abuse, particularly of children in Central African Republic by UN peacekeeping soldiers. So you have those sort of mistakes, but then on the other hand, you have those errors of the United Nations which are sort of by design, right? Which are when you can't get food to Madaya and Daraya in Syria because you have to deal with all these political actors and players, or you can't get a political resolution to South Sudan. Which sort of fault of the UN bothers you more? The structural stuff that it can do nothing about, or the individual errors like cholera and sexual abuse?
Well, I think it's a mix. Of course, the Secretary General cannot do much when the Security Council is divided as it is today, and especially on Syria, on South Sudan, so major crisis of our times. But the Secretary General could have engaged more with some quiet diplomacy with various actors. He could have had a more strategic approach to these various actors that do not see, the UN, that do not want the UN coming to their country. So it's a bit of both. Of course, the UN is an intergovernmental organization, so it is as good as its member states are willing to be. And it's always very difficult for the Secretary General to find some room of maneuver between all these states and all these interests.
You mentioned the Security Council, and you mentioned it almost as if it handcuffs the Secretary General and so many others. The Turkish President, Erdogan, has said the world is bigger than five. Others have called for new members or more members to be permanent members of the UN Security Council. Can the United Nations only truly reform when that is re-looked at because it's a vestige of the new world order created post-World War II?
Well, yes and no. I mean, the five permanent members of the Security Council are still the great powers today in terms of diplomatic power, militarily, economically. And of course, you have several countries that are knocking on the door of the Security Council for quite some time already. But the problem is that the current powers of the council, see the reform of the council with great reluctancy. So, unfortunately, the reform is currently blocked. It doesn't say that the council cannot function. But and that's why it has developed some transparency, but it's true that the world, the Security Council doesn't reflect as much as one would like to the state of the world, even though the permanent five are still the great powers of today.
Okay, so Ban Ki-moon is done and dusted, and there's a lot of talk of him going back into politics back in South Korea. The new man, Antonio Guterres, much loved. I've never heard anyone say a bad word about this man, but he's got a challenge ahead of him. You mentioned security was a weak point in Ban Ki-moon's legacy. How is Antonio Guterres going to be any different and to make a difference on things like Syria and South Sudan and so many massive security problems around the world?
Well, I think, first of all, I think he is willing to engage on quiet diplomacy, on mediation. He has, certainly more empathy towards his interlocutors, and he has a vast experience of engaging with, states or actors that do not want peace in the first place. So I think his experience will be very helpful for him to engage again with all these actors on all these crises.
Big picture, as a final question, the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And I look at it, it has no poverty, quality education, reduced inequality, peace, justice, strong institutions. I read this, and there's a part of me that says this is a solid framework that could be achievable, and these are lofty goals, and another part of me says these are platitudes, and they don't mean anything, and they're really not achievable. What do you think?
I think, of course, the answer is in between. You need to set goals, you know, in order to have a strategic path and to lay down policies towards those goals. So I think these are valid goals. Of course, it's up to member states of this organization to abide by those goals, to act, really, to put the funds in place, to put the money on the table to achieve those goals. And there, the Secretary General can push them to achieve those goals, to meet those goals.
Dr. Alexandra Novoselov, thank you very much for joining us. Good to talk to you.